Hello, everybody, and welcome to our podcast, Unpacking Organizations, where Rupert and I talk about our passion topics and bring a lot of thoughts for you to deal with in your day to day organizational challenges.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.
So, today we want to start with traps, some traps around like when we do organization design, what are the big traps that we fall into? But before I get there, hi, Rupert, and welcome.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How about you?
Living the dream.
That's amazing. That's what I wanted to hear this morning. We are starting the spring in the Northeast, so it's very nice and bright, and sunshine is here, so I'm loving it as well. Rupert, talking about the traps, you have actually written a lot about that in your book, where you have actually fallen into one of the traps, even though you knew the theory, you knew everything about it. And that trap was designing around people. And I think sometimes it's not a trap. It is actually a default that people apply on because it's easier. It is what makes more sense, and it's least disruptive sometimes. And so many times when we are not in a org design practitioner, we actually go there by default that we should design around people. But we know as org design practitioners that this is a trap. And even though knowing all the theories, we sometimes fall into it. So why don't we unpack that today? And I would love to start from your story that you have written in your book.
Thank you. So, I mean, it's just a classic. It's cobbler's shoes to an extent. I mean, the first thing I should say, this story is actually quite an old one now. So I was a relatively new CEO. I'd probably been a CEO for maybe 3-4 years. And, we were growing fast and it was exciting. And, you have a leadership team and, people put pressure on you and they demand things and they demand certain roles. And my father and grandmother used to have a saying, which is anything for peace sakes, let's keep the peace. And so instead of having the conflict and dealing with it, you go with it because you don't want to have the battle, you don't want to have the fight. And so so what I did, having done as a management consultant, lots of org design work, advising others, and I was actually in the process of building an org design software platform. So the irony is thicker than most. And, I think I'd even started writing my book, right? Like at least, slowly I'd been writing blogs and things. I was beginning to, this is sort of in the early 2010s. But I succumbed and we did org design and people demanded things and, and I succumbed and I designed around people. And I can tell you that the peace was very short-lived.
I hear you.
I was not.
Yes.
And the conflict actually became greater and the organization really struggled. And, there were other factors, but there were points where the business actually went into jeopardy. And I think this was one of the causes of that. And it's a very easy trap to fall into. It's very easy because an org chart is such a simple thing to draw. Like, we can just draw it on the back of a napkin. It's very easy. And it's very easy to say, okay, you do this and you do that because, in terms of role allocation and responsibilities. And, when you feel that you're in a rush and you're trying to do things quickly, et cetera, you're like, okay, you do it, you do that. And know it's wrong, but you're like, well, it's fine for now. And you kind of kid yourself.
Right. And especially so when it's a small team and you're all hustling and it's easier.
We weren't that small. I mean, we weren't like 10 people, we were like 40. And that was maybe 60, and that was also part of the issue, is that as you're growing and you're growing fast and everything else, it's easier to fall into these traps as well. And
Right.
So it's I think I've been through multiple different stages. I've been a leader in a business from very small, 6-7 people up to 300, and as a leader, and each there's the Grainer curve. Like each stage you have a crisis, and as you go through that crisis you have to redesign and rethink about it. And it's and when we've done research, and that this research is quite old, but I did it years and years ago, and I asked people what were the biggest issues you faced. I mean, designing around people was mentioned all the time, as one of the most common. And then what's the consequence? Well, because it's wrong, the design's wrong, that becomes apparent. It becomes apparent to other people that it's not nepotism, but you're doing favors for people, so it becomes more political, not less, right? Because it's horse trading, and you feel you just feel a bit dirty because you're doing things for political reasons and what have you, and you're trading and horse trading really, and you're not doing things from first principles, and then when it bites you, it just doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel right. But when all eyes are on you and there's time pressure and you're doing a million things, being a CEO is a really lonely job as well. And you have lots of different pressures. And it's why this book from McKinsey, CEO Excellence, and they really talked up, like, one of the 6 things is org alignment, and within that, org design is one of the key elements for CEOs to get right. It's why, this is a little bit meta, but as a CEO, someone who's been a CEO now for a very long time, and it's so crucial, but it's so easy to do badly. And we were chatting about this, before we went on air, if we can call it such a thing. I think what's interesting, Shradha, is that you haven't experienced it as much, but that's also there's a bias in that, because every time, when you're a consultant, you were brought in to do this, and then you've also worked in quite large organizations which have hired you in an org design role, so clearly seeing the value of it. So I think there's I think your experience is interesting in that you're probably an outlier in having not seen it as much as others.
Absolutely. And I would say you're bringing a very good point. But in the large organizations as well, Rupert, whenever there is a new business being set up or something new that they're trying to do, then the starting point is always through a person. It's not that we need this role. It's always that, okay, this person is the right person to lead this, which sometimes I'm okay with, right? That's how we need to bet on a person, not on a role. Fine. But then once the design starts to happen around that team, or it starts to scale up, if we continue to apply the same principle of designing around people, that's when it starts to become a trap. And what I've seen, as you mentioned, like, these things come with a very, very short expiry date. The piece stays for very less time. And what happens is it becomes political, but also that the leaders and the people move on. So if you have designed around people, that means if the person is moving on, you have to redesign it. You're like, every time you have to pull it apart and put it all together, because the person doesn't want to be there for rest of their lives. They want to move on and have their growth as well. And so because of that, it gets very very messy and very very all over the place in that sense, because every time a person leaves and now that person comes, you have set a precedence that it is based on the person's choice or preferences, not what the role demands them to do. So it gets very disruptive for the team as well, right? Because every time the new person comes, there is no precedence around the role and what a role wants. So yes, it is something which has short-term gains, but really big long-term pains. So
yeah. And it's so obvious why people fall into it, and why I fell into it. You know, it's all well
Yes.
and good for us to say, well, you shouldn't do this and beat our chests. It's a really, really easy thing to fall into. And
So how do we avoid that, Rupert?
I think it's
Um,
courage, to be honest with you. I
hmm,
think this really, okay, knowledge is one thing, but if you're listening to this podcast and you have the knowledge of that much, so knowledge is one thing. But I don't think you need a lot of knowledge to know that this is not right. If you know the term org design and what have you, you know it's wrong. So I just think it's literally courage and the ability to deal with conflict, and to kind of face up to those things rather than let them, And so that I think sometimes people don't realize, the power they have, to make the changes, and they feel that others have got more, and sometimes it's just, you've just got to just accept that you're just going to have to have a little bit of a battle, and then it's not going to be as bad as you think either, because if you do it from first principles and you explain why and everything else, like if I would go back and coach myself, from whatever it was 12 years ago, or, I think I could very easily convince, the Rupert then how to deal with it, just by being a little bit
yes.
courageous and explain and kind of work it
Yep.
through, and just take the time with, but if you're in a rush and you da-di-da, then,
Right.
just take the time, just take it, you have it. And then I think I would have been fine. And I'm sure, others who are listening to this podcast who are coaching people probably, that need
Right.
the help, and just explain this is a normal thing. And it's one of the reasons why I like all the stuff about all the stuff, having difficult conversations and dealing with conflict, and all these things that are, out there, I think are useful as well, just to kind of bear in mind and deal with. And
I agree with that. So I would like to highlight one point that you brought, was that we need to align with our own value system and principles, because that gives us a very steady ground when dealing with conflict, because then we know why we're doing this. It cannot be that, one day because we think this way, the other day we think this way, and that's why we're doing it. If we're very grounded and aligned with our own principles and value system, that why is this, and why this company needs a certain kind of action, and therefore I'm doing this, it is much better for you to explain yourself, as also have a better sleep at night, right?
yeah,
Because then you are not thinking about that you're favoring one person or doing something in, like, doing something injustice. It's all about in um, in a sense of, or in light of, the principles that you want to follow for your
yeah,
business. So,
cool. Thank you for
Rupert,
that.
of course, what is your takeaway? What is your one big takeaway on this?
My one big takeaway, well, my one big reflection, which is, for me, is I wish I would have had the courage. I had the knowledge,
Mm,
and I wish I would have made the time and had the courage to have the conversation and do it properly. And I know everyone that's done this, because I've heard so many war stories of this
yep,
kind of designing around people, feel the same way. So that's kind of
absolutely.
my big takeaway. What about you, Shradha?
I think it's similar to yours. I would say that don't be afraid of conflicts. Like, sometimes conflicts are good and it helps us find a different perspective. So be curious when you are in conflict, but don't be shy from the conflict. And I think
Yeah,
it says the same thing. I'm just using a different language, but uh, organizational tensions are inevitable.
yeah,
It all
exactly.
depends upon what kind of tension do you want to exercise. Do you want a tension between people, or do you want a tension between organizational positions?
Yeah,
And
and yeah,
yeah,
and so to
that's what
cut
it
through,
is.
but that's why, like, agreeing on things like the design criteria is so key, because that's where the
Right,
tensions come out,
right,
and you
right.
have to if you don't agree the design criteria and you don't agree what you're trying to achieve, you end up in this, and you end up trying to
Right.
optimize for two or three things, and you're just dead in the water, which is part of it. Sorry, but just it was a thought
No,
that came into my
all
head.
good. All
Cool.
good. Thank you for sharing. All good. You didn't cut me off. You just added on to mine. So thank you
Thank
for
you,
that.
Shradha.
Well, thank you, everybody. And Rupert, looking forward to our next one.
Until next time, take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye now.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.